Dr. Norman, thanks for joining me here today.
Good to be here, Henry. Thank you.
I'm going to start out by giving a little bit of background on Dr. Norman and his work before I jump into the questions. So Dr. Norman is the director of the Humanism Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University. He's a philosopher who coined the term cognitive immunology, which is the emerging science of mental immunity. He thinks this science explains how demagogues short-circuit minds and how ideologies corrupt moral understanding. In his book, Mental Immunity, which I am holding right now and I had just finished reading, he identifies several mental immune disorders and develops the kind of mind vaccine that could inoculate future generations against the worst outbreaks of viral nonsense. So just to get an idea of what you mean by cognitive immunology, it's not really a discipline that I think most of our audience is familiar with. Could you start out by giving an example of when a person's mental immune system is working well and an example of when it's not?
Sure. You'll have to call me Andy, though, instead of Dr. Norman. So imagine that you and I are, sitting around the fire pit, and I say, hey, Henry, reach in there and grab me one of those hot coals. You're likely to say, thanks, but no thanks, right? Now, what probably happens in your mind when you do that is you run a little simulation and you figure out what would happen if you did pick up one of those hot coals in your hand. And your mind tells you that's a bad idea. I'm not doing it. That's your mind's immune system in action. It's testing an idea and finding it to be a bad one and rejecting it before it can affect your behavior. So we do this kind of thing all the time. And I define mental immunity as the mind's resistance to the uptake of bad ideas. I argue in the book that bad ideas, especially infectious ones, actually are literally mind parasites, and that we need to learn how to spot them and remove them if we want to become wiser versions of ourselves. So that's an example of your mind's immune system functioning properly to spot and screen out a bad idea. I'll give you an example of my mental immune system misfiring. This goes back a couple of decades. So I was raised in a family that practically worshiped Martin Luther King. And he was something like a secular saint in my family. And then I learned at one point that Martin Luther King was unfaithful to his wife. And when I heard this, I just couldn't believe it. In a way, in a certain sense, I refused to believe it because I didn't want this new information to sully this thing that had come to seem precious to me, right? The Martin Luther King as moral exemplar. Now, I remember distinctly what happened in my mind when I first encountered this information. My mind actually started to generate all these reasons to dismiss the information about King's infidelity. And one of them stood out. One of them was, I bet that J. Edgar Hoover, who was then head of the Central Intelligence Agency, generated this as a way to smear Martin Luther King. Now that kind of fit a narrative that I had in my mind because I know a certain amount about the way in which, did I say CIA? I think it was the FBI.
Yeah, yep.
But I now realize that what my mind was doing there was generating antibodies to this new information and perceiving it as a threat and trying to fight off the new information, even though the information was true. So it turns out that doubts, questions, reservations, these are the mind's antibodies. And your mind can generate a superabundance of them. And sometimes they attack even good information and prevent it from entering and entering your mind and educating you. So that would be an example of the mind's immune system misfiring and preventing you from learning. And I eventually came to realize that my mind's immune system wasn't serving me well there, and I had to update my thinking.
So good information in this case is not defined as information that makes you feel good, but quite the opposite, an uncomfortable truth that you ought to know and acknowledge as true, which is what it was.
You're exactly right. And you raise a very deep question, which is what makes an idea good or bad? So it's generally believed that truth is a good quality in an idea, that falsehood is a bad quality. But it's also true that we care about whether ideas make us feel good, whether ideas give us comfort, whether ideas prove useful. And ideas can have those properties quite independently of whether or not they're true. So sometimes an idea is good in one sense, but bad in another. And we feel pulled in opposite directions. So does that make sense? And the important thing is to remember not to favor short-term emotional gain at our long-term collective expense.
I see. This is a question I was thinking about as I was reading the book. You often compare science against faith, and faith is often an example of, often it's not really grounded in evidence. It's just grounded in potentially upbringing or something that makes people just feel good for multitude of reasons.
Right.
And is it possible, though, that there are some things that may not be true, or at least can't be proven to be true, but they are also good in the sense that maybe it's a lie or can't be proven to be true, but it makes enough people feel good, and maybe something bad doesn't happen as a result?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. I think the religions of the world are built around the insight that carefully curated beliefs of a certain kind can provide psychological and social benefits. So many people find that the idea that, Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior provides a kind of solace and comfort that serves them well. Notice that what religions are doing there are saying we recommend certain beliefs because of the downstream causal benefits of those beliefs. Now, scientists, on the other hand, have always been focused on what I call it the upstream evidence for a belief. And science has a community that tries to assess beliefs purely on the basis of the evidence. Meanwhile, religions are basically been advocating for certain articles of faith on the grounds that they are beneficial to us morally, socially, emotionally. In the book, I actually try to show that we can actually adjudicate this long-standing debate between science and religion by acknowledging that both upstream evidence and downstream consequences, both of those things matter and should be taken into account when we assess ideas. Does that address the entirety of your question, or
Absolutely.
only part of it?
Great answer. And another question I was thinking about as soon as I started reading the book really is that we got a little bit of background about you're been a professor for a long time, and you specialize in philosophy as your discipline. But what inspired you to write this book in particular at this time in 2021, 2020?
Yeah. Well, this is going to connect with the story you were sharing before we began this session. I've been deeply concerned about divisive ideologies and the way they're impacting our nation and impacting the world, and the way in which people can fall into an ideology. When we speak of conspiracy theories, we often say that conspiracy theorists have gone down a rabbit hole. Well, I actually think we can go down rabbit holes involving political or religious ideologies as well. So I think we need a deeper understanding of what it means to think responsibly, what it means to believe responsibly. And philosophers have been thinking about this question for a very long time. And you can take what they've learned, what we've learned in the process, and you can use it to shape some guidelines that can help us dialogue better, that can help us avoid rabbit holes, and that can more generally help our mind's immune systems function at closer to peak capacity.
I see.
I actually think that our mental immune systems are currently functioning at a fraction of their capacity, and that's why genuine wisdom is so rare.
Could you give me an example in the day-to-day world of what leads you to believe that?
Well, I mean, I think almost any night of the week you can turn on the news and hear stories about people with unhinged ideologies doing things that are either damaging our democracy or, causing harm to other people. There are ideologies on the left that are not serving humanity well. There are ideologies on the right that are not serving humanity well. There are religious ideologies that are divisive and that are preventing humanity from coming together with a shared understanding of right and wrong. And there are secular ideologies that are not serving humanity well. And we actually need to work out shared standards of accountable cognition. And then we need to jointly enforce those norms of accountable talk, not in any coercive thought police kind of way, but through gentle collaborative dialogue where we help each other see the defects in the beliefs that we cling to and identify with.
And when you say we, I suppose you're speaking of society as a whole, perhaps America, perhaps the West.
I mean all of. I think I mean all of humanity. So I think every human being matters, and I think every single human being deserves a voice. And I certainly don't think me and my fellow cognitive immunologists have the right to dictate, which ideas are the good ones and which ideas are the bad ones for everyone. I'm not claiming to be the arbiter. I actually think that the right answer to this question is that dialogue ought to be the arbiter, but it has to be dialogue that is conducted in a way that allows dissonant voices to be heard, and that allows objective considerations to carry the weight they ought to have.
I see. There's this sense, just broadly speaking, at least in America, that there's been a massive decline in dialogue, really. People aren't open to hearing opinions that they dislike. Particularly one narrative that I hear over and over again is about specifically universities. And I know you're in academia. Mm-hmm. They're quite hostile. The universities are really generally quite left-wing, liberal, progressive enclaves. And oftentimes now this is what's being reported anyway, they are incredibly hostile to any speech that violates the liberal progressive consensus of today.
Well, here's my take on this. It is true that higher education has become a largely progressive liberal enclave. I think that the claims that universities have become just factories for leftist for producing leftist activists are wildly overblown, and people are fear mongering about that. The people I've met in higher education genuinely want to promote open inquiry and dialogue in their classes. And while there are exceptions, and there are outrageous exceptions that take the form of, woke counterculture progressivism, I do not see the kind of scary maladaptive culture growing in higher education the way some do. I think, in fact, universities provide lots of space for people to inquire together. And every single professor I know cares deeply about allowing their students to debate ideas and explore them in an open way. So I think that higher education has gotten a bit of a bad rap, in part because it's politically expedient to fearmonger about higher education in our day and age. But we certainly need to promote dialogue where conservative voices get an honest hearing as well as progressive ones.
Yeah, I think a lot of the frustration, at least from people on the conservative side of things, they suggest that on campuses these days, a lot of words that they believe and a lot of policies that they believe in are now classified as violence. Like, let's face it, conservatives and liberals have been fighting on campuses for a very long time, right? Arguing about minimum wage, should we have open borders, not open borders, and religion, all that stuff. But these days, there seems to be a movement on the left, and I personally did see it when I was over in university myself not too long ago, that a lot of standard conservative policy positions, let's say we shouldn't increase the minimum wage because XYZ economic factors that are detrimental to the working class. Even if you disagree with that, that's not the point. And but now it's being equated as being being a threat to marginalized communities, and marginalized communities are often identified on a based off their race or religion or their gender, sexual orientation.
I can validate this, that the phenomenon you're talking about is happening on university campuses, and it does not promote fair and honest inquiry in the way that universities should. I think you can actually gain a deeper understanding of what's happening here by viewing it through the lens of cognitive immunology. Because when people on the left view conservative ideas as a threat, a lot of times they'll attack those ideas rather than listen and learn from them. But the exact same thing happens the other way around, right? When conservatives here come to identify with their conservatism, then progressive proposals often are perceived as a threat to their way of life, and their mind's immune systems overreact in ways that attack actually information coming from the left that actually deserves a hearing as well. So when culture wars break out, mental immune systems become inflamed, people become unable to hear one another, and dialogue and discourse decay rapidly. And we're seeing this now, but it's happened throughout history. What we need to do is learn how to calm our mental immune systems, step out of fight or flight mode, right? The threat is imminent mode, and actually begin to dialogue patiently, honestly, and with a genuine desire to understand what people on the other side are trying to say. That's the way you calm mental immune systems and begin to enhance mental immune function and wisdom on all sides.
So do you have any practical advice for non-philosophers, non-cognitive immunologists on practical steps that we can take in our everyday life to boost our own immune systems? The way I just got my COVID vaccine, I know that my immune system is very boosted again, at least for the next 6 months to a year against COVID. What can I do to improve my myself mentally?
Fantastic question. So I'll offer a handful of suggestions. Number one, learn to listen to your doubts. So doubts are the mind's antibodies. And a lot of times they're trying to alert you to a problematic feature of an idea. So even that little tiny voice in the back of your head that says, "Oh, that sounds good, but there's something not quite right here." Listen to that voice, because it's trying to tell you something. It's pointing, it more often than not, it points to a genuine defect in the idea that you must take account of to be fully mindful of where that idea might take us. So listen to your doubts and your mind's immune system gets stronger. Ignore those doubts, your mind's immune system gets weaker. At the same time, understand that doubts should not always be taken at face value. Sometimes our minds generate hyperbolic doubts or extreme or overweening doubts, and you need to learn to think. You need to learn to question even the questions.
It's like an autoimmune disorder in a person.
Autoimmune disorders of the mind actually exist, and the book goes into that. And it turns out there's a whole lot of mental autoimmunity going on these days. Here's another thing, practical suggestion. Always reason to understand and to find out, never reason to win. So again, when culture wars break out and we start using reasons as weapons to defend our point of view and to attack other points of view and defend our own, it turns out your mental immunity starts to decline when you buy into that. So always check that especially when you're reasoning with somebody who differs with you, always check to make sure that you're reasoning collaboratively in an attempt to promote joint understanding, common understanding, rather than to try to defeat an enemy.
Ooh, I think that's a tough one. I'll speak for myself. I know that's already tough because I'm prone to, I believe I know something about certain things. And as soon as somebody raises an objection to it, I can't help it. I know I'm not supposed to do that, as you said, but I immediately get a little defensive. And I want to take out my sword and start hacking away at the argument. Not even thinking that, hey, maybe that I could be wrong.
It's a very human thing to do, right? And I've certainly been there and done that myself. One of the things that helps me is that I just practice the art of mutually respectful dialogue week in and week out. So as a philosophy professor, this was my day job, right? My day job was to facilitate constructive inquiry, honest, constructive inquiry and dialogue on some of life's deepest questions. What's right? What's wrong? What makes some acts right and other acts wrong? How do you build a genuinely just society? These are the questions that have historically divided humanity into warring camps. And what philosophers have always done is they've come together in a spirit of collaborative inquiry and said, let's actually see if we can understand together what these concepts really mean. Concepts like justice and truth and knowledge and good and bad. And when you do that, you actually learn, you calm your mind's immune system so that you're not ready to jump down other people's throats when they start to challenge your point of view. So we can all practice this art and get better at it.
I think just armchair philosophizing here, I think one way that this could be possible is if people didn't wrap up their own self-worth into their ideas.
And that perfectly anticipates the next point I was gonna suggest. There's a phenomenon psychologists called identity protective cognition. And here's the idea. You hitch your identity to a certain set of values or a political ideology or a religious identity. Then when anybody raises questions about those things, your mind immediately treats the question or the challenge or the challenging information as a threat, right? You can go from 0 to 60. You can get a mental autoimmune reaction going very, very quickly. And the way to avoid that is not to hitch your identity to any ideology, not to hitch your identity to any set of beliefs. Instead, hitch your identity to the idea of honest inquiry. And you can calm your mind's immune system and learn to think more clearly and in a more fair-minded way about many things.
Yeah, I see that as a challenge. There's a lot of people who, because a lot of our seemingly non-ideological characteristics, some people identify a lot with their, let's say, their religion. Mm-hmm. They say their fundamental identifier, if they're asked, what are you? Besides saying I'm a man or I'm Henry, they'll say, well, I'm a Muslim or I'm a Christian, I'm a Jew. And those aren't just superficial identifiers, which they can be too, but they also come with a lot of ideological presuppositions. And I find it challenging to believe that people would drop for example, their religious identities altogether and say, oh no, I'm a follower of truth and science and reason. I don't see that as a very captivating pitch to give to billions of deeply religious people around the world.
Yeah, I think I don't have any illusions that this will be an easy sell among the religiously devout. But one of the really important implications of this science that's emerging right now is that religious, faith-based identities are genuinely corrosive of healthy mental immune function. So, in fact, there's been an empirical study coming out of Canada just in the last couple of years, led by a man named Gordon Pennycook, and he basically showed that if your attachment to certain articles of faith compromises your resolve to change your beliefs whenever the evidence changes, that will make you more susceptible to conspiracy thinking, more susceptible to extremist ideologies, more susceptible to science denial, and a whole bunch of other deformations of thought. So the idea that each and every one of us has an obligation to change our minds in the face of good reasons, better reasons, and good evidence, that turns out to be a very powerful immune strengthener. In some ways, that's kind of the heart of the mind's immune system, and you have to protect it if you want your mind to function well in emotionally charged domains.
I see. And I'm going to ask you about if you think that these two ways of looking at the world and looking at your own mind can coexist. Can you be a good practicing, let's say, Christian or Hindu Jew, while maintaining a strong cognitive immune system? And I will say that I think a lot of objections you may hear from specifically the religious people is that they say that some things that you implicitly credit as being good, such as human life and social values, that aren't really, I mean, one could say they're arbitrary if you look at the span of human history. People have been absolutely brutal to each other, across pretty much every culture. But there are some religions that have, and since the Renaissance, for example, in America, for example, the American Bill of Rights was very much inspired by the Bible and this idea that each human being is inalienably worth of, they're God's children, so they have intrinsic value. This idea is quite revolutionary if you look at it in a historical or international context. Lots of cultures still don't really believe that.
Yes, right? and so I was going to mention this in answer to an earlier question, and I'm glad you brought me back to it. The idea that every human being has dignity and has rights, that's an idea that has had enormously positive impact on human prospects. So when that idea took hold during the Enlightenment, violence, 10 different measures of human violence and inhumanity all plummeted, sometimes by an order of magnitude or more. The concept of human rights is enormously beneficial for our collective well-being, and yet it's one that we have no empirical evidence for. So the claim human beings have rights is not evidence-based, right? And yet it's enormously useful. So that's a really powerful example of a belief that is a good idea because of its downstream effects.
Right. You almost take it on faith.
Almost. I guess, so the term take it on faith can mean a couple different things. So I'm a little reluctant to go there. And there's actually, I think, a really interesting argument to be had about, whether faith-based traditions or the tradition of reason and humanism that came out of the Enlightenment, it was the main reason why the concept of rights spread and made such a big difference. My guess is that credit for that particular conceptual invention can be shared between the scientific tradition and the tradition of religion. But wherever it came from, the evidence is overwhelming that it benefits us, and that without protections for our rights in place, man's inhumanity to man can get truly awful.
I'm glad you addressed that. That's a point that I had been wondering.
I think it's for those enamored of a scientific approach to idea testing and who are accustomed to looking only at upstream evidence, it's a very helpful corrective to think about the concept of human rights, because it illustrates in a very dramatic way that upstream evidence is not the only relevant consideration when it comes to idea testing.
Right. We saw that the eugenics movement was, totally inspired by the scientific revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, right? And they looked to science for the answers, and we saw what that led to eventually, culminating really in the Holocaust, right?
Well, and a good part of the motivation to develop eugenics of the kind you mentioned came out of a sort of a social Darwinist point of view, which basically held that the weak which went beyond the science to say that, the strong should eliminate the weak to strengthen the species. Now, we now know that claim is not supported by the science alone. You have to build in some very problematic value assumptions to arrive at that social Darwinist solution. But once you do, you can justify some pretty draconian eugenicist policies that we all rightly reject today.
Absolutely. And I want to bring us back to a question I was going to ask you earlier when we talked about when we are trying to address this problem and boost the collective immune system. And I talked about, you said that it applies to every human in the world, but now speaking in America, mostly to Americans, policymakers, teachers, educators, parents, what can we do in America from a policy standpoint to improve, enhance the mental immunology of Americans?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. I think that we need to treat mental immune health as a public health problem, and mental immune disorders as a threat to public health. I think the insurrection of January 6th is a vivid demonstration of what happens when misinformation can spread unchecked and hijack immune compromised minds. So I hope that that way of framing it doesn't strike you as too partisan, but I
That's
think
okay. We have lots of partisan coverage here from all sides, so no worries.
Yeah, so we need to develop herd immunity to the worst forms of cognitive contagion, just as we need herd immunity to COVID. And to get there, we need to inoculate a whole bunch of minds. Now, I'm not advocating vaccinating unwilling minds. I think first and foremost, we need to inoculate our own minds by learning the principles of sound idea testing. And we can help each other, help our friends inoculate their minds through dialogue, through conversation with them. It has to be the right kind of dialogue, the right kind of conversation. And I think the low-hanging fruit here involves educating the next generation. So the research suggests that it's relatively easy to prevent a mind infection, and it's a lot harder to cure a mind infection. The way the researchers talk about this, it's easier to pre-bunk than to debunk. So if you can help somebody learn to spot disinformation before it takes hold in a mind, you can prevent them from going down the rabbit hole. It's a lot harder to pull somebody out of the rabbit hole. And so I think that public policies that spread cognitive immunology principles among educators so that they can actually help to strengthen the mental immune systems of the students they work with would be money very well spent and a hugely powerful investment in our nation's future. Now, I'm not saying you should give up on your cranky uncle who thinks that the jackbooted thugs are ready to come and grab his guns. Conversation with him might help him climb out of the rabbit hole too. But that's hard work, and it takes a ton of patience, takes a ton of understanding, and it takes non-judgmental listening and clarifying questions.
I see. And is there something in particular that students younger students in particular, actions that teachers or educators can take? Because I feel like a lot of this, it's more of a mindset phenomenon, yes. Right? And it's tough to teach people like, your cranky 65-year-old uncle to think differently. You can teach them new facts, but to approach facts differently is a matter differently altogether. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how can we help young people to think more critically and approach these problems the way you've described.
Yeah, so I did Joe Rogan's podcast just a couple of days ago, and since then, teachers from all over the country have contacted me and said, at least 3 of them have said, "Help me understand how I can help my kids develop mental immunity. I want to have the kind of lessons that strengthen their mental immune systems. Andy, do you have a curriculum for this?" And I haven't developed one specifically yet, but I've had a lot of practice working with kids and young adults. And I think I don't know, maybe that's my next book. But even this summer, I'll be working with some educators who work in K to 12 and other educators at the university level to revamp their approach to teaching critical thinking, to help kids develop the kind of deep immunity that current approaches just aren't conferring.
Right. I think society would very much depend on, very much be helped by the younger generation, thinking a little more critically than us and our generation, certainly, about these problems.
And with the internet, it becomes that much more imperative, right? That our hyperconnectivity now makes it extremely easy for problematic ideas to spread. And we now need levels of immunity that no previous generation ever had to have just to keep cognitive contagions under wraps.
Absolutely. I mean, there's just information overload. Everybody knows this example of when you have a sore throat or you have a little bump on your thigh and you Google it and then you come out convinced that you have cancer. Maybe not you, but definitely me, my friends, my family. It's all happened to us. And it's this information overload too, where we are fed in info and new facts. And we have more information at our fingertips than any of our ancestors did, combined all together. And it poses quite a problem. Like, how do you even go about processing that without having the right mindset and framework to think critically and ask the right questions and be skeptical?
That's right. And actually, history provides some important answers to that question, because each time a powerful new information technology has come along, disinformation has proliferated wildly until people's mental immune systems began to cope with the levels of information. So when written language was invented, disinformation and crazy ideologies proliferated through the ancient world until Socrates came along and came up with, hey, here's a Socratic method that'll help you deal with it, and help to bring the infodemics that were happening at the time under control. When the printing press was invented in the 1453, I believe, it wasn't long after that before Protestants were slaughtering Catholics and Catholics were slaughtering Protestants, and over 100 years of religious warfare led people to become absolutely disgusted with faith. But eventually the Enlightenment came along, maybe a century later, and said, here are some ways to think reasonably about these deeply divided issues. And the wars of religion calmed down, and a higher degree of mental immunity spread through Europe. When the telegraph brought light speed communication into the world, when radio allowed Hitler to galvanize the masses in Germany, these powerful new information technologies allowed people to hijack minds and subvert mental immune systems. And it took years, and in some cases decades, to counter those tendencies. We're going to have to do it all over again now for the internet.
I think the work is cut out for us, certainly. But Dr. Norman, Andy, if you prefer, I've really enjoyed speaking with you here today. Here again is the book, Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. It is available on Amazon, and I imagined anywhere where you can buy a book these days if you want a physical copy. And really a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope we can do this again.
And thank you, Henry. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you all the best.